Hello there. Authoritarian dictatorships are pretty common throughout human history, and from the casual observer, those on the extreme left, communism, such things, and those on the extreme right, fascism, they superficially can seem quite similar, but there's reasons they're given different names. They have different ideologies, different policies, and a different worldview and ideology on how they see things. This can be very easily reflected in the Confederacy of Earth and the Terran Empire, two authoritarian regimes of imperialistic powers that superficially seem similar but are actually quite different. And although they are often compared together because they're both human, they're both alternate realities, and they show the dark side of what humanity could become, they are still very distinct entities and are quite different from one another. But what exactly are those differences? That's what we're going to discuss here today. We'll start with the Confederacy of Earth. Now, the Confederacy of Earth is actually, in many ways, a lot worse than the Terran Empire, in my opinion, in some of its outlooks. In general, they still seem to have some level of, we're going to generously call it functional democracy, but I think it's functional democracy in the way the Soviet Union or North Korea have a functional democracy. It doesn't appear to be a strict autocratic system. There does seem to be some public sway over who's in charge. They're ruled by a president, but again, I should point out, so is the Soviet Union and so is North Korea. The president seems to hold absolute authority, but is answerable in the same sort of structure as a president is in, say, the United States, to a Senate or Congress of some kind, which does appear to represent the people overall. However, their society has more liberties than that of the Terran Empire. Such concepts such as freedom of movement, a certain degree of general personal freedom, freedom of the press, things like that, do, or at least appear, to have some liberty within the Confederacy. However, due to the Confederacy's extreme xenophobia and mistrust of aliens, this is limited, strictly limited, only to human beings. And non-humans have been relegated to the roles within their society either as simply servants of some description, which quite frankly by the 25th century they've got AI that can do it quite happily for them, but they still have a use for those races, as long as they can control them. Now the Confederacy, as I said, is deeply xenophobic, and this of course would influence directly how they would interact with other races. Humanity of the Confederacy saw other races as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, a dangerous threat that needed to be eliminated, and literally nothing else. It was a human-centric view on the galaxy. A secure galaxy, a safe galaxy, is a human galaxy. A galaxy guided by the corrupt and brutal hand of humanity only to favour its own. Based on the appearance of the population, you can see that the elites of the Confederacy are the ones with the real power and the wealth, whereas the populace seem to, if you base it on their dress and the way that they seem to conduct themselves, they seem extremely angry and xenophobic, clearly, but they're not as well presented as those you would see in the masses of the Federation, or even of the Terran Empire. The Confederacy, though, does like to keep the veneer of that it's, although it's definitely a human-centric society, it is trying to keep this veneer, this illusion, that it's ultimately all in the best interests of the masses of humanity and not necessarily about a power grab for those elites of their society. They utilize things like the execution of the Borg Queen as a populous moment to show the greatness of humanity and the dangers of the alien, and they couldn't have picked a better target realistically than the Borg. However, it should be noted the Confederacy had accomplished a great deal in the same amount of time, subjugating, conquering, or in some cases completely eliminating whole races, utilizing biogenetic warfare against the Klingons, extermination tactics against the Cardassians, and subjugation tactics against Vulcans, Andorians, and others. The Confederacy is an empire in everything but name, but ultimately humanity is at its heart. They're its center, and they like to present themselves as a society that is still democratic, has rights, and its people matter. Their version of Starfleet would be the Star Corps. This was a purely military version of Starfleet, as you can tell from ranks such as General and the overall arcing structure of the organization, but it operates much more like, say, the United States military. Not that I'm implying the United States military is, of course, an overbearing military force. It is ultimately a force for democracy in the world, for better or worse. The Confederacy serves only itself, and the Star Corps exists not just as a military weapon to be used against the alien, but also to be used against whomever else might present a potential threat to the Confederacy. For example, perhaps even its own people. As I said, it's an empire in everything but name. It likes to give its people this illusion that they actually have rights and freedoms, which they do, but only when you're comparing them to others. But they use the threat of the alien as an excuse to trample the rights further of their own people, while elevating a small elite of military commanders to high levels of positions. This is reflected even in the dress uniforms, not just of the military personnel, but even of President Hansen, whose outfit is more befitting that of a military commander than a civilian. Use an individual such as Adolf Hitler as a comparison. In his earlier career he did wear a suit, but in his later days you very rarely saw him in anything other than a military uniform when doing his public addresses or any form of public appearance. This was to denote the war footing of the regime, but it's interesting that that sort of mentality has survived into the 24th/25th century with the Confederacy, indicating we are dealing with a very far right, extremely malicious regime in the form of the Confederacy. Now let's juxtapose that against the Terran Empire. Now I've covered the Terran Empire fairly extensively on this channel, and very likely this video is part of that same playlist, but in a shorter form, so I'm not rehashing things I've gone over in before. The Terran Empire is, although superficially similar to the Confederacy, it is very different. I'll give you a point of example. When Kirk visited the Mirror Universe and the crew of the ISS Enterprise turned against him, they still had to have a justification for doing this, to mutiny against their captain. They saw him as ineffectual, he wasn't doing his job, and his elimination would have allowed them to rise in rank and become more wealthy, more powerful within the Imperial Starfleet. But they had to have a rationale to do this. But the point is, that kind of behaviour and mentality is accepted in the Terran Empire. Yes, it's not good, but it did allow for the most ruthless and the most brutal individuals like Kirk to arise in rank and become more powerful. Now, as I've stated before, no regime or system could really work like this, because you'd never have additional officers and men and personnel to rise to the rank of captain naturally to fill new positions within the fleet. Not everyone could advance in rank through mutiny and other such methods, but those systems were allowed. However, Starfleet, if it deemed that they were not done properly, could, of course, then order your execution. This incredibly cutthroat methodology was more reminiscent of the old Roman Empire than, say, a more modern state like Nazi Germany, or potentially even the Soviet Union, like the Confederacy seems to be a sort of weird blend of. The Terran Empire is a more autocratic regime, ruled by an emperor as well, not by any illusions, any pretense that other people have rights. The Empire is all about selfishness. It's about achievement on your own back, ruthlessly stepping over other people, Terran or otherwise, in order to prove yourself, become wealthy, become powerful, and achieve greatness in life. It is theoretically possible for any Terran to rise to the rank of Emperor, just like it was in the old Roman Empire. However, it is infinitely more likely if you already have the money, the wealth, and the connections to do so. Individuals like Lorca, Michael Burnham are good examples of this. A better example of someone rising up and becoming Empress without such aid would be Commander Archer or Ensign Hoshi Sato from the ISS Enterprise. The Terrans are also much more of a straightforward imperialist power. Their conquest of other races isn't guised in a we're defending ourselves and guiding the galaxy to be better. We're turning the alien to be more like us, which is something the Confederacy effectively was doing, guiding other races to be more like them, to be under their control. But the Terrans are less interested in that. Yes, they will integrate other races into the Empire. Yes, they will sort of subvert their culture and abuse them and rip them of all their resources, but ultimately, that's where the similarity ends. The Terrans probably have more in common with the Dominion. They will integrate these races, kind of get them all working together under Terran rule, but more or less rule by proxy, with governors rather than direct necessary military force like the Confederacy seems to heavy-handedly use. The Terrans are not afraid of utilizing weapons of mass destruction and death on a huge scale, just like the Confederacy. But again, that's where a similarity ends, but we're dealing with extreme ends of the spectrum here. The Terrans are a society that's much more in tune with the idea that we're selfish, we're ruthless, and you achieve power through ambition and will. Whereas you can accelerate in rank in the Terran Empire through normal development, you can also do it, as I said, through mutiny and assassination if you have a just cause. However, if you were to try to use the same tactic in the Confederacy, you would be court-martialed and executed. Yes, a mutiny can occur aboard a ship, even in the Confederacy, as they do seem to follow the same basic rules we have now, if the command staff or commanding officer of said ship is incapacitated in some way or is seen to be acting against the will of the regime that they represent. But however, you don't get to be promoted because of it. You would more than likely simply be killed. And the Confederacy didn't put up with it the same way the Terrans did. In some cases, the Terrans actively reward such behaviour, again ensuring that only the most savage and ruthless individuals get to the top of the pecking order, and they're the only ones really strong enough to stay there in the Terran Empire. The structure of the Empire, working from the top down, starts with the Emperor, their immediate acolytes and advisors, the Lords of Terra, which basically make up a sort of Senate. These individuals also help govern the Empire, being assigned specific regions of space or worlds to which they will directly administrate. All of these individuals have military authority and command over Starfleet. Starfleet, much like the old again Roman military, is an extension of the will of the Emperor and the High Lords, and similar to how senators in ancient Rome also had command of armies, Julius Caesar for example, it was an expectation the Lords of the Terran Empire have a similar function. They work as the executive branch, but also the military command structure, which in the Empire are fused together and not separated like in the Confederacy. Moving down from that, there will be a large bureaucratic organization, although we don't know much about this. It has to exist because the logistics of running just Earth alone would require monumental numbers of personnel and people and a bureaucracy. But running an empire? It's going to require thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of Terrans, and maybe even a few non-Terrans, helping in the general day-to-day administration and operation of the Empire, because as we know, soldiers win battles, but logistics wins wars. And the Terrans and the Confederacy have to actually apply that philosophy if they're going to run any kind of empire. So again, on that level, we're going to look at quite similar, but that's just human nature. Below that, of course, you've got Starfleet, who are both a military wing for the Emperor's wrath and control of Earth and the rest of the Empire, but also its military arm for its expansionism and its defense, so they are both the sword and the shield. Starfleet of the Terran Empire, unlike its Prime Universe version, is an Imperial Starfleet. It's pure military. The ships are just warships, again, much like the Confederacy. Even sharing designs, I should point out. But the Terrans, again, they're a much more vicious people. They do operate a human-centric society, however, in their culture, non-Terrans can actually progress through the ranks and even become emperor, potentially. That would be unthinkable in the Confederacy. No non-human holds a position of high authority within the Confederacy. There may be outliers to this, maybe half-humans or something of that nature, but generally speaking, only humans. And the Terrans, although are primarily a human-first society as well, they respect power and strength, and ultimately their integration of races into their society as sort of second-class citizenry allows a greater deal of flexibility than the Confederacy perhaps wields. This could also be shown in the way that Earth is portrayed. In the Terran universe, Earth is perfectly fine. It's a thriving, M-class world with billions of sentient beings on it and plentiful natural resources, whereas the Confederacy has exploited resources at the point where they have to protect the planet with a shield, otherwise its population are going to get irradiated. So there are differences. Ultimately, one is a pseudo-democracy and the other one is an autocracy. And they're, from the top down, these two regimes reflect everything about that. Just like many autocracies, they have all of their acolytes and ambitious people waiting in the wings. They have their favorites, they have their favorite captains, their favorite admirals. All the people around them are positioned by the will of the Emperor, whereas in the Confederacy, the people more likely, more routinely, and in a better system, earn their rank and position through skill, savagery, and competency. Individuals like General Picard, pioneering the campaigns against the Klingons, the Cardassians, the Bajorans, and the Borg, was an outstanding officer, considered the greatest general in human history. Whereas, although there were Terrans that accomplished such similar feats, such as Kirk, even Lorca, a lot of them earned their position more through who they know and through backstabbing and treachery, rather than pure competency. This meant that a lot of the people near the top of the Terran Empire quite often were there more because they were ruthless and brutal rather than cunning and intelligent. That's not to say that, of course, the Empire didn't have that system in place, but it is to point out that these two regimes are very different. They only seem superficially similar. And that is the analysis of these two regimes. As I said, they are very similar because ultimately they have similar goals, but the goals, although similar, the execution is extremely difficult. Terrans will often sacrifice defense for constant expansionism, which was one of their greatest weaknesses, as great men are conquerors, not peacemakers, to quote Jonathan Archer. The Empire, of course, recognized more broadly that these skills and these subtleties were necessary. People at the level of Empress Georgiou, for example, understood that a certain degree of subtlety was needed, and diplomacy even with the non-Terran species, especially the greater powers, whereas officers at the command level within the Imperial Starfleet didn't always recognize this level of intrigue that was needed. This was one of the Empire's greatest undoings and its weakness, whereas the Confederacy was much more ordered, with a very strict military structure. And although again the Terrans could get away with a little bit more, ultimately, in order to function, it was also a disciplined military fighting force, but when it had no one to fight, it would often turn on each other, and this meant that the Terrans basically had to be in a constant state of war, whereas the Confederacy would probably settle into a peacetime insular system because they were much more xenophobic, whereas the Terrans were more willing to embrace non-Terrans and their technology and constantly expand. It's of course not this black and white. Like with any regime, you could spend years studying it and find all kinds throughout the different eras of its history, find individuals and different facets and intrigues of their culture which would denote a difference, and as well as similarities to one another, which we've not explored in this video. But broadly speaking, you've got an extreme right-wing fascist pseudo-democracy and a autocracy ruled by an emperor and a system of administration that relied on favoritism. So there we have it. That's the analysis of these two powers. Let me know in the comment section below what you think, and point out any other differences that I have missed or similarities that you think actually make these two cultures more similar, because I would be very interested in this, because it's a general topic within Star Trek which is interesting, because there are alternate timelines, alternate universes, and it's very easy to see how humans ended up different, and perhaps easy to see why, say, the Vulcans were so worried about humans in those early days, because you can see where we might have gone if it weren't for their interference.